I grew up in Brynmawr in the 80s. I had a fantastic childhood. We might not have had the internet, cable TV or 3D computer games, but we'd always find ways to keep ourselves entertained. We would often play ball games on the green outside my house. Inevitably, a ball would stray into a neighbour's garden, if we were unlucky, hitting a plant pot or a window. If we were fortunate enough to have our ball returned, it was usually on the condition that we moved on and found somewhere else to play. More often than not, we would trudge up the hill from my house, trying to get to the open fields at the top. There we could climb trees and play football to our heart's content. To get to the fields, we would have to cross an old cemetery, an eerie place that always made me feel uneasy. Stranger and eerier still, there was another smaller cemetery within, enclosed with large pine trees with a small stone building at the entrance. It seemed mysterious, cut off and fenced in. On closer inspection, I noticed unfamiliar writing on the gravestones. It wasn't English, or Welsh for that matter. It was something different. I never dared to venture but a few feet into this strange and mysterious place. I was too afraid to. Years later, I discovered that the strange cemetery was Jewish, and that the unfamiliar writing was Hebrew. Growing up, I'd never met or was aware of any Jewish people living in Brynmawr, and other than the cemetery, I'd seen nothing to suggest that there was ever a Jewish community here at all. Occasionally, I'd ask older people if they remembered anything. Some stories would crop up time and again, but you'd get different versions from different people, like Chinese whispers. More frustrating still, most people knew nothing at all. I recently moved back to Brynmawr, having spent some years away. I'd almost forgotten about the cemetery, but rediscovering it has given me a fresh appetite for the subject. There was a large Jewish community here, but who were they? Where have they gone? What is their legacy? And those Chinese whispers, there must be some truth in them somewhere. Now seems a good time to find out. The Jewish migration to Wales started around the late 1800s. This was facilitated by the advent of the steamship and the industrialisation of Britain, built on the enormous demand for coal and steel. A large proportion of the Jewish community who first settled in the valleys were refugees of the pogroms in Eastern Europe, moving here to rebuild livelihoods, to find peace and commerce. Jewish settlement spread throughout the South Wales valleys, from Llanelli in the west to Raglan in the east, Cardiff in the south, and Brynmawr in the north. Brynmawr, according to the statistical unit of the Board of Deputies, at one time had the largest concentration of Jews in proportion to the British Isles, boasting 2 congregations and a Hebrew school. Conrad Kammerman is the last surviving member of Brynmawr's Jewish community. He now lives in Abergavenny.
You had a lot of Jewish immigrants at that time because of the anti-Semitism, especially in Russia and even in Poland as well. They were, I remember my mother said that the Cossacks, the Russian Cossacks, used to come down with their swords, going in, killing people and what have you. So that's why they moved out, for safety reasons. My father was the oldest of the children that my grandmother had, and he had to go to work, so he worked underground for a while. My mother got left 2 shops in Bailey Street, which one time they say called Jew Street because there used to be such a lot of Jewish businesses there.
Initially, Brynmawr's Hebrew congregation would worship at a private house here on Bailey Street. Until recently, the building was distinguished by a small stone statue positioned on the front wall below the joining of the roof. It was the Lion of Judah, overlooking the congregation and the ever-growing Jewish community on the street that would become known locally as Jews' Row. Sadly, the statue no longer remains. No one knows what happened to it for sure, though there are rumours that it may have ended up in a skip. I've heard varying accounts as to which building the statue adorned. Some say it was this end of the street, maybe the chip shop, the hairdressers or the dental surgery. Others say it was the other end of the street, maybe the Indian takeaway. Again, most people have no recollection of it at all. As time went on and the congregation grew, so did the necessity for a more suitable building. In the late 1890s, a proposal for a new purpose-built synagogue was commissioned. For a time I believed that the synagogue had been demolished. I was informed that it was pulled down and the fire station built here in its place. I've only recently discovered that the building still stands, just there. It was converted into a house in 1965. The fire station was built next to it at a later time.
The main thing I can remember on the special occasions, which is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, which is the Jewish New Year, I can always remember a big crowd of us walking up, dressed in our smart suits, walking across the square, up to the synagogue. And I can remember the service there. We had a Jewish minister called Mr. Starr, that was his name.
It may seem strange now, but all of the major towns in Blaenau Gwent used to have synagogues. In Tredegar, the synagogue is now a private house. Abertillery, now a furniture depository. Ebbw Vale, demolished. Though many of the refugees successfully integrated themselves into local communities, not all local communities were so welcoming. In places, there was resentment and hostility towards Jewish property owners and commercial enterprises. In August 1911, tensions were running high. A railway strike had produced a shortage of food and other goods, with a corresponding rise in prices. A series of coal strikes had occurred in protest at wage reductions. Families were suffering extreme financial distress, and in one Valleys town, things were about to kick off. I caught up with David Evans, whose father was present at the Tredegar riots.
Yes, my mother and father were there involved in the riots. They were standing in a crowd by the clock in Tredegar, and a lad the same age as my dad, about 16, he up with a stone and said, "These Jews are the trouble," and threw a stone through one of the shop windows in Iron Street. Well, from there it led on, nearly every shop was wrecked down Iron Street, and people took what they could gather, like a lot of idiots, you know. It must have been 2 days later, the troops arrived in Tredegar, probably came up from the barracks, and of course the whole town went down to look at these soldiers. It was like going down to see a circus. One of the important looking men there pulled a piece of paper out of his glove and read it out. Well, the people didn't know what he was saying. He'd have Oxford accent, and most were speaking Welsh in any case. They didn't have a clue what he was doing. But of course I worked it out quickly when my mother told me he'd read the Riot Act. But they didn't know. He blew his whistle, and the soldiers charged the crowd and beat them about with their buttons, knocked them to the ground and ran over them with their horses and all sorts of things. Subsequently, every house was searched. They went from house to house in Tredegar, searching the houses. And if they had anything that was from one of those shops and they didn't have a recent receipt for it, they went to jail. And my father told me that they didn't live long after they came out of jail. Most were dead in 3 or 4 months. He said, I don't know what they did to them, but they didn't live long. He said they buried there in Dewston Cemetery.
Thankfully, no one was killed or seriously injured. But why did the riots happen? Why did events escalate to the point where Home Secretary Winston Churchill had to send in the troops? The most widely accepted theory is that the riots were not religiously motivated, but came as a consequence of the hardship of the time. News had just reached Tredegar of riots in Llanelli where 2 men were shot dead by the army. Indeed, there were riots elsewhere, all connected to the rail and coal strikes. In Tredegar, it just so happened that many properties were owned by Jews who became scapegoats for a minority of drunken hooligans who managed to cause havoc. However, there is a more controversial theory. There are reports that those who were arrested were not drunken hooligans, but considered to be respectable colliers. There are accounts of members of the mob singing their favourite Welsh hymns as they smashed and plundered properties. And there is evidence of Baptist antagonism towards the Jews at that time. Whether or not the riots were religiously or racially motivated is a matter of opinion. But whatever feelings triggered the riots in Tredegar, they were felt elsewhere. The riots spread through neighbouring valleys towns, and all of the Jewish communities that crossed their path were met with hostility and violence, their properties looted and ransacked. However, this was not the case in Brynmawr. Shortly after 8 p.m. on Tuesday the 22nd of August, a mob of around 100 strangers appeared at one entrance of the town. Their presence attracted hundreds of townspeople here to the town square. The officer in charge, Sergeant Thomas Price, ordered the mob to fall back. When they refused, the sergeant and his constables charged the mob with batons. They turned and scattered. Shortly after, an appeal was made for ordinary townspeople to volunteer as special constables. They flocked to the cause, and under the leadership of Sergeant Price, they set about reinforcing the town's defences. A couple of hours later, around 10 p.m, the mob returned and advanced towards the town square, heading for Bailey Street. On the way, they smashed the windows of a jeweller's shop owned by a Mr. Cohen. Several civilians interfered before Sergeant Price arrived with the special constables, finally dispersing the crowd and taking 2 men into custody. The townspeople hooted and cheered in celebration. An article in the Brecon and Radnor Gazette dating from August the 31st celebrates the town's triumph against the mob.
Whatever may be said of the disgraceful stone-throwing and looting tactics at other places, Brynmawr can claim credit for its prompt suppression of outside hooliganism. The townfolk were determined not to let the city of the hills be tarnished by a gang of youths and men. The Jew may be despised in some places, but in Brynmawr he is respected, and his Gentile friends and neighbours were determined that his liberty should not be interfered with. The behaviour of the town, in short, is a credit to Breconshire, and future generations in Brynmawr can refer with pride to the manner in which their forebears acquitted themselves during a time of crisis.
After the riots, life returned to normal. Times were tough and would continue to be. There would be further economic depression and 2 world wars. Soon, the synagogue would close, the Jewish community would move on, and traces of their presence would all but vanish. Though most of the history regarding the Jewish community in Brynmawr has been lost, not all has been forgotten. For some, memories remain.
I remember A.B. Brest, who had a furniture shop in Brynmawr, Jack Cameron, Joe Lyons, who had a garage, Star, who was the last rabbi in Brynmawr, Mr. Siddle, who was a watchmaker in Brynmawr, Johnny Morris, who was the jeweller of the hills, Marx was a solicitor in Brynmawr, Mickey Jacob, he had a fruit and vegetable shop, there was Solomon, he used to go around selling from a suitcase.
Well, one of my earliest memories of when I was very young was going over to Leah Cohen to poke the fire and light the candles, because she was my teacher at school and she knew me, so she was quite happy for me to go in the house to do that every Friday night.
So that was for the Sabbath?
Yes,
the Sabbath.
yes, yeah.
And would you get, would she give you any money or
Oh no, she
anything in
wouldn't
return?
give me any money, but she always gave me a nice piece of unleavened bread.
Is that special bread?
It was like a plate, yes, special Jewish biscuit really.
Was that nice?
Nice, it was lovely. Probably used to eat it before I got home.
I believe you have a story regarding the birth of your daughter. Can you talk me through that?
Tracy was born in January, and I lived with my mother-in-law and father-in-law, and my wife was in hospital giving birth to Tracy, and we didn't have a telephone, but opposite us where we lived was a fruit and vegetable and fishmonger called Jack Cameron.
Was that on Bailey Street?
In Bailey Street itself. Jack came over and knocked the door and said, "I'm a proud father of a little girl." And from that day, Mrs. Cameron would always send Tracy a Christmas card and a Christmas present and birthday presents. And more often than not, when Tracy could walk and cross the road by herself, she would go into the shop and be spoiled rotten by Mrs. Cameron and Jack Cameron.
Do you recall any members of the Jewish community working as miners?
Yeah, Jack Cameron. Jack Cameron himself. He told me that he worked in Bynan's colliery. Jack was a very hard-working man, and it's very unusual for a Jew to work underground. But Jack was a very hard-working man.
My father, in the early 1940s, they bought the fish shop in the top of King Street.
And of course it was a busy little shop, I think, because the cinema was opposite there.
They used to get him coming up from the army camp in Gilwyn, because he used to do it always with oil. He managed to get always done the cooking with oil, which he was allowed to have oil because on religious grounds.
He was a lovely man, I got to be honest, and his wife particularly. Yeah, we were sorry to see them leave.
So where did the Jewish community go? Well, within Wales, largely back to the coast, Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, and further afield, London, Israel, and the rest of the world. But why did they go? In truth, the community never really established themselves. They weren't here long enough to lay roots. When they first arrived, the whole area was prosperous. There were opportunities, people could make a living. But as time went on, those opportunities dried up, and so the community had to move on. One thing is clear, speaking to older generations in Brynmawr: the Jewish community is sorely missed, because they were an important part of this town. It's been a fascinating journey learning about the town's history. And though many questions remain unanswered, what I have managed to find out makes me very much proud to be part of this town.